Let's start 10.7 with some facts about complex numbers. This number here, I, we define this to be the square root of -1. I'm even going to put a little DEF on top of that. So when you see the square root of -1, automatically replace with I. So this is a new number, and this is an imaginary number. This is imaginary, right? Because square root of negative numbers, no real numbers. So we invent these new numbers called imaginary numbers to take care of these square roots of negatives. So square root of -1 by definition is I. Then, if we square both sides, what we're going to get here is that I squared is -1. So here's one fact, that I is square root of -1 and I squared is -1. So in problem number 7, we're just given this. We're given the square root of -1 and we're asked which one is this, and they give us some different choices. But square root of -1, this is I, and I know that because that's the definition of I. Why is this so? Because we define it to be that way. So this is a new number. It's out of the real number system, so you may not have seen these before, but you're just going to have to accept this and get used to this, that this is a new number, an imaginary number, square root of -1, and we call it I. And in number 9, this one here, I squared, well, this is -1, right? And that's by our definition. I squared is -1. Why is that true? Because of definition. So let's look at this one. This is 1 over I, and here's how we're going to do this. You remember back in a couple sections ago when we were talking about rationalizing denominators that had radicals, and we multiply in the top by 1. So what we're going to do here is the same type of thing. Let's write 1 over I. We're going to multiply by 1. But the one that we're going to choose is this one. I'm going to choose I over I. And then on the top, what we get is 1 times I, which is I. And on the bottom, we get I times I, which is I squared. But I squared, we know that that's -1, so I get I over -1. But a number divided by -1 is just negative that number. So what we're saying now is that 1 over I is equivalent to -I. Now in number 36, we've got the square root of a negative number. We know that this is not a real number. But now we have new numbers for this. We have imaginary numbers. It turns out the square root of -36, although not a real number, is a pure imaginary number. The way we're going to deal with this is this. As soon as you see the square root of a negative, you're going to take an I out. This is imaginary. And then we're going to write the square root of 36. Square root of 36, we know is 6, and I'm just going to write this as 6I. So here's what we're saying here. We're saying that the square root of -36 is 6I, and we can show this, we can prove this in this way. What if you take 6I and square it? Well, we're going to get, right, we're squaring the 6 and the I, so when we do this, we're going to get 36I squared. But I squared we know is -1. 36 times -1 is 36, so what we've done is we're saying that the square root, back up here, the square root of -36, well, we can do it here. Square root of -36 is 6I because 6I squared is -36. So in general, we're going to say this. Here's another fact. If we have this, let's suppose A is greater than 0 or even equal to 0. So just think about A being 0 or maybe a positive number. Okay, then -A, or the opposite A, is less than 0, right? So -A, this is a negative number. And then if we write this, the square root of -A, first thing we're going to do is take an I out and then deal with the square root of A. So this fact here says if we have the square root of a negative number, right now A is positive, so -A would be negative. Square root of a negative number, that's going to be I times the square root of that number. So just a quick example here. Back in the one that we just did, well, let's change it a little bit. Suppose we take this, the square root of -49. As soon as now what I've got, now look at this, right? There's the negative, There's the 49. So first thing we're going to do is take the I out, deal with the 49. We're going to get I times 7, or maybe a better way to write it is 7I. Now look at this one in 15. Here's what we have first of all. First of all, I've got a negative, and then I'll deal with this. So this is the opposite of the square root of negative 9. So I'm going to bring that negative sign down, and then let's just deal with this part right here. I'll take the I out, square root of 9, which I happen to know, so it's going to be negative I times 3, or how about negative 3I? And this negative here, we've got a couple of negatives. This negative here is the one up at the beginning, right? This says the opposite of that number. Well, that number is 3I, and we want the opposite of that. So we can use that same fact over here. We've got the square root of a negative number. Let's take the I out, square root of 15. But 15, we can't do anything with 15. 5 and 3, 15 and 1, we can't simplify that. So square root of negative 15, the best we can do is just write this as I square root of 15. And, you know, if you're careful, you could write this. But commonly, if we see a square root and an I, we're going to write the I out in front, just so we don't do something like this. What if you're working kind of fast, and then you write this? Now, in this one, you don't know, look at how I wrote that. You don't know if the I is inside the radical or outside. I mean, if you make a point of writing it on the outside, that's fine. But typically, probably a better way to do it is just to write the I in front of any radicals that appear.